for the longest time, there was kind of a dismissal of the continent as a charity case. There is conversation around investments and private sector activity on the continent. It's a shift.
Africa is the second largest continent in the world after Asia and accounts for about 1/5 of the Earth's surface. The 54 countries in Africa have an enormous wealth of mineral resources, including some of the world's largest reserves of fossil fuels, metallic ores, and gems and precious metals. But in addition to its resource-rich land, Africa is now emerging as a hub for green energy and technology innovation. Joining me now from the Qatar Economic Forum is Ahunna Eziakonwa, UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Africa. Ahunna, one of the UNDP's project that we have been talking about is the Timbuktu project. Can you start us off with describing and telling us more about what that is?
Right. No, thanks, Pamela, for having me. Timbuktu, let me start with the name. It is a place in Mali. It's not a mythical place, it actually exists. And it is the birthplace of commerce. Some of the oldest universities started there. It's also the birthplace of knowledge and innovation. And it's also the home of the richest man that ever lived, Mansa Musa. So we chose that name very deliberately for this initiative because it's important for the younger generation of Africans to understand their rich heritage in innovation and wealth creation and sort of going from there to Africa's future. So it's a fusing of the heritage, the traditions, and the future vision. But it is a recognition that startups on the continent of Africa are bringing a lot of value to the development space. The startups are not just small businesses. They are actually innovations trying to solve development challenges, right?
And trying to disrupt.
Trying to disrupt and going to scale. They can be scaled. So, everything, like when people talk about Africa, there's a tendency to talk about small things, micro this, micro that, small this, small that. And, you kind of have conceptualizations that are quite limited. And I think with Timbuktu, we are indeed sending a message of disruption, that the continent has to be about big and bold initiatives. Because you have young people who are committed, but also talented, and they do want to be part of the development transformation on the continent. So we want to invest in them, and it's ambitious program, $1 billion over a 10-year period, supporting 10,000 startups, hopefully scaling about 1,000 of those. We're looking at materializing unicorns, but also supporting these startups that could go ahead to become businesses. They don't all have to become unicorns. But more importantly, we're creating a Pan-African movement in this sector. Because you have 54 countries on the continent, as you said, regional integration is vital for Africa's future development.
Yeah, it sounds like there's certainly an abundance of talent that can use the support. One other thing that's certainly in abundance in Africa is sunshine. And with this opportunity for Africa in terms of what you are calling a green industrialization, can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Right. So when you think of the future of development, I think it's going to be determined in Africa. Because you see, people are today talking about decarbonization, net zero. The world is not sustainable unless we can start reducing emissions. How do you reduce emissions? You have to invest more in renewables. Where are the renewables found? Renewable energy is mostly places like Africa. We have sunshine in abundance, but not just sunshine. We have wind, we have geothermal possibilities, and of course, hydro. So everything that you need actually to construct a carbon-free world is there on the continent. So green industrialization for us is like a gold mine for a future sustainability because African countries have not really industrialized. So we're not talking about a transition from heavily carbonated industry to a decarbonized one. We're talking about African countries that can start off with greener pathways, so we don't have a lot of adjustment to do.
Yeah. A lot of the conversations about Africa oftentimes steer towards or center around poverty, with hundreds of millions of people living on less than $2 US a day. But your modeling suggests that green growth could, in fact, lift all tides, lifting the standards of living, lifting not just for the elite, but people out of poverty.
Absolutely. I think what we're looking at is shared prosperity and investing in sustainable futures. And here you can really begin to make the experimentation in Africa by making sure that development investments are more inclusive. So jobs is a really hard one for countries now, because we have a lot of young people graduating from universities, much more connected, much more enlightened, much more, I would say, educated even. And many of them possessing a lot of skills. But the jobs are just not there. The opportunity to engage their skills not there. So green transitions could provide such opportunities. 600 million Africans without electricity right now. So, that's $1 trillion investment opportunity. But also, depending on how you invest, we can create jobs through these green pathways.
While we're still on the subject of Africa's green industrialization, the UN has been advocating for active carbon markets. Why is that?
Yeah, no, that's another resource right there that is in abundance on the continent. Look at the Congo Basin, huge carbon sinks. And right now there's a scramble for carbon, right, for carbon credits, because that's helping to offset emissions. And Africa needs to figure out how to commoditize this, and make sure that it is getting the value for what it has in terms of its carbon credit assets. So we're very interested in seeing how that can contribute to improving the financing reality of the continent.
You mentioned earlier there's less of a transition because there is not the burden of legacy, but there is, with Africa being fossil fuels and mineral resource rich, is the balance when it comes to the global demand for these resources and the resulting export revenue, and then trying to move into a greener economy. How does that work?
Yeah, no, some African countries that have found recently oil and gas will tell you that, the argument is for gas to be seen as a transition fuel because it's got lower emission rates. And so because African countries are still trying to construct their economies and to grow, they can't abandon those resources. They would have to make choices to see how those can contribute to their financial status. So gas is definitely one that is being pushed as a transition fuel. For the rest, I think there is a huge commitment by African countries to honor their nationally determined contributions, including oil-producing countries. And you have to look at each of the plans that they have and see the ambition they've set out. That they're really committed to net zero. But what they are asking is that you do this on a case-by-case basis and develop a pathway to net zero for every country in terms of their transition, of where they are at in the transition. So don't have a template for everyone, but rather really look at each country's context and support the development of greener pathways, which includes investment in making the transition. So you don't ask countries to give up their resources and just, witness their people continually become poor, witness the rise of poverty of their people without any alternatives. So what countries are also asking, we want to make the transitions, but we need support with technology. We need support with financing. We need support with capacities that allow us to go there faster.
Certainly. One of the things you mentioned, gas, for foreign direct investment coming into Africa and greenfield projects, there has been a surge in energy and gas since the pandemic. Why do you think all of a sudden the interest from overseas and foreign capital?
Well, I mean, you can see that some of the conflicts in the world have actually contracted the resource flow in the energy sector, in gas and oil. So African assets became all of a sudden quite attractive. So it's just a demand factor, right? But also, I think Africa promises a lot of greener alternatives. For instance, you see a lot of investment in green hydrogen, whether it's in Namibia or Mauritania. Investors are looking at those possibilities because, again, the continent has a lot of renewable possibilities. So you can process gas in a greener way, through solar, through hydro, through wind. And in some of the locations, you have this combination, Namibia being an example. So that's very true. So the continent is quite attractive in terms of where countries want to go with energy access.
Now, Ahunna, you're clearly very passionate about Africa. I love your LinkedIn profile. It says, "The Africa that we want is the Africa that the world needs." Can you elaborate on that?
If Africa gets it right in terms of the green transitions, green pathways to development, that will benefit the world. So if the world invests in green transitions and in creating jobs for Africa's population, the world also benefits because we will reduce some of the incidents that we're seeing now of conflict that lead to a huge number of refugees, but also migration issues that countries in Europe are worried about. For instance, irregular migration that sort of also disrupt cultural dynamics in those countries. Not to say like migration is a negative thing, but when it is irregular and when it is also creating a lot of tension, then it is negative, right? So I think getting it right in Africa in terms of making sure that there is decent jobs for the population, that we're having more sustainable development pathways, that we're using innovation and technology to transform the development landscape so that development is much more inclusive, inclusive development, then you are actually protecting the rest of the world as well. So the Africa we want is definitely the one that the world needs.
Now, you have advocated just in our conversation for the young people, for the poverty, and you're also a very strong advocate for women in particular. How is that group different?
We need to address inequality and gender inequality in particular. So when it comes to national development plans that we support, we make sure that there's a gender lens in the way resources are allocated. Because women are resourceful and they are carrying the families, but they need a bit of a break. We need to make sure that their work is valued. And also we need to see more women in leadership positions, particularly political leadership. So that's another thing we're investing in, because when women are the hem of decision making, the decisions are much better. I can guarantee that, particularly in terms of influencing livelihoods and humanity, because they know what it is in the room, what it's like in the room. They know, they feel, they're right in the middle of it. So we need to get more women making decisions at the top.
You were born in Nigeria. You've worked in a lot of different African countries in different roles over your career. What would you see, what has changed over that period of time? Has there been improvement, marginally?
Right. I think Africa is very different from what it was even just a decade ago. First is the realization that actually Africa has something to offer, in its people. It's not just the resources that are extracted, but the population. I mean, it's 1 in 3 young people by 2050 will be African, right? So it will be the largest workforce that the world has in a decade, right? In a decade's time. So lots of awareness created among Africans of their own strength. I think for the longest time, there was kind of a dismissal of the continent as a charity case. I think some Africans may have even started to believe that, but there's been a real awakening in the last 2 decades that no, Africa can stand tall with its resources, both natural and human resources, and compete globally. So that shift is really important. It's the shift that I call agency. You are having much more African agency, both in terms of people and states. So confidence, that breeds confidence. And that's why we're seeing this burst of talent among young people who are actually quite defiant. I mean, they have a lot of fences to scale, but despite the challenges, they're going out there and breaking ground. I mean, we have breathtaking innovation by young people that are of global quality. In other words, not just solutions that serve Africa, but solutions that the world needs, right? So I think a major shift in confidence, in understanding of what Africa has to offer, in understanding of agency and how it needs to take control of its own destiny. You're seeing a lot of development work now financed by Africa. Aid is declining. And there is even this conference here, this meeting here, the conversation around development, the fact that I'm here as a development entity, talking about investments and private sector activity on the continent, not just aid. It's a shift.
Yeah, a big mentality shift. Now, 20 to 30 years ago, it was really about China emerging as an economy, and now they have grown to a global powerhouse. Do you see Africa following a similar trajectory?
I don't think it's even a question. I think Africa would get there, because you're talking 54 countries with vision to have regional integration. Without regional integration, I think it will be more difficult. But I think with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which the member states have signed up for, it makes Africa a 1.3 billion people market today, right? And that's trillions and trillions of dollars of transaction, right? So that makes Africa actually a region to reckon with. And if you just look to the future with that, because the populations are also going to double in a few years, right? And you imagine the weight of Africa's presence on the global market.
Right.
I mean, that's going to be hugely influential, right?
Yeah.
All right.
India, also a very good example, as well as a very large population. They've gone from being also rich in natural resources, but over the last 2 decades has become sort of the technology engine of the world. Are there industries in Africa where you see where there is a global advantage?
I think there's a global advantage in the green technologies, particularly energy, right? As I said, there was, for instance, the idea of green hydrogen. That will be the first time, that you see investment in that kind of really sophisticated area on energy. So energy is a big one. I don't quite see any region in the world that will surpass Africa in that sense, also because of the abundance of renewables. But I think just in terms of human capital, because you're still going, even with AI coming on stream, you're still going to need a lot of human intelligence to run the world. And that's going to be, Africa in terms of the future, in terms of young people presence. And I think really the population dynamics weight in favor of Africa when you look at the future.
And speaking of the future, we'll sort of finish with your predictions for 50 years, 100 years from now. Where do you see Africa?
I think we can only fall in love with the future. That's my approach. That saying, it says, love your future more than you hate your past. And I think as long as we have this optimistic approach to the future, we will write the future, and we'll make it better despite all the uncertainties that surround us. Yeah. So my overall philosophy is really to fall in love with it. And then, it cannot cheat you.
Well, on that very optimistic note, a very big thank you to our special guest, Ahunna Eziakonwa, UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Africa. Thank you for being on this special edition of I See Your Trade at the Qatar Economic Forum. Thanks for tuning in to episode 11 of I See Your Trade, Season 4. I See Your Trade is brought to you by IC Markets, the leading high-performance trading provider. Trade up to IC Markets. See you next time.